Glenn, Chief of UN Publications, and I have the privilege of overseeing the bookshop at headquarters and also in Geneva. And I'd like to welcome you all to this very special Meet the Author event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce USD for Global Communications, Melissa Fleming.
Thank you very much, Mary, and good afternoon, Excellencies, the many colleagues in the room, and the many friends here. It really is a pleasure to welcome you here to UNICEF House for this very timely conversation. We are marking the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, as you know, and this is somehow fitting. But I'd like to begin by thanking the UN Foundation and UNICEF for hosting us in the Danny Kaye Auditorium. And we may hear more about what's next Danny Kaye with former UN Secretary General Thant and our special guest today. And indeed, we are honored to have you with us. Your latest book, Peacemaker, is a moving tribute to your grandfather, Thant, and a compelling case study in ethical leadership in the multilateral system, a leadership style that resonates profoundly today. 80 years ago, the United Nations was born from the ashes of war, carrying a bold promise to unite nations in the pursuit of peace, justice, and human rights. Today, that promise is being tested by geopolitical conflict, polarization, the rapid spread of disinformation, and eroding trust in public institutions, including the United Nations. Yet the need for global cooperation and for the United Nations, I would argue, and I think we all would here, has never been greater. One of the most powerful tools we have to build cooperation, though, and I am leading global communications at the UN, and usually we put out our communications in the form of short form. I am a true believer in the power of books. Books connect people across borders. They have the power also to nurture empathy and spark the imagination needed to get people motivated to get involved to solve our greatest challenges. And they are, as in many ways, at the heart of the UN mission. And I'd like to quote Malala, who reminded us, one child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Storytelling through books transforms the abstract into the tangible. The climate emergency becomes more than a headline. Global displacement, more than a statistic. Human rights abuses, more than distant reports. When global challenges are made concrete, people care. And when they care, they act, pressing for solutions. Dear Thant, your grandfather led the United Nations through the turbulent 1960s with quiet strength, humility, and moral conviction. He diffused crises, championed decolonization, and consistently spoke out against injustice. And long before environmental issues rose to the top of the global agenda, he also of ecological decline. Peacemaker is more than his biography or a vestige of an idealistic past. Thant's fight for peace is central to understanding our deeply divided world today. And through your exceptional storytelling skills, his vision and values come vividly alive, offering guidance and inspiration for the presence, again, in the power of the book. It is now my great pleasure to invite you to the stage, and I think we are all very much looking forward to your walking us through the highlights of this story, the story of your grandfather, the story of an iconic figure for the United Nations, as we also reflect on our own history during our 80th anniversary year.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's really wonderful for me to be back in New York, which is my hometown, to be back at the UN and in UNICEF, and to see so many old but not really old friends here, as well as many others. And thank you so much, Melissa, for those very kind words. And thank you to both the UN Foundation and to the UN for organizing and co-hosting this event. When I first thought about writing this book, it was something I wasn't really prepared for. This was, I guess, 4 years ago now. It was just after the pandemic, and I had moved from Myanmar, where I had been living for about 10 years, to the UK, and was thinking of writing some new book. And I was thinking of writing a book about Myanmar history again, which I've done in the past, maybe a deeper history in the 18th and 19th century. But every evening, I kept looking at the thousands of documents from the UN archive that had been digitized over the past many months and years. And these included both official documents that had been declassified and made available over decades, over the past years, but also personal records as well. So when U Thant died, this was in 1974, a few years after he left the UN, my parents, who were living with him at the time, gave everything that was in his study, or almost everything in his study. So all of his personal papers, parts of his diaries, medical records, photographs, birthday cards, everything to the UN. And these have been largely digitized and, again, available. And as I was looking through these documents, I realized that there were lots of things, both about him but about the UN and about that time, that I didn't know. And I thought, maybe I'm reading too much into this. I looked at the New York Times from that period. I saw he was in the headlines on issues that I didn't really know that he had been involved in. And I went to the library. I took out every book I could read on the Cold War, on the 1960s, on episodes like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Six-Day War. And again, I saw things, or I thought I was seeing things in the archive that was very different from the scholarly accounts, but even secondary accounts till very close to the present day. So I thought there's a story there, there's a book there, there's something that I should look at. And in a way that I've been very happy to do at this sometimes dark period in our history. I've been living in another dark time, but in the 1960s, which, despite all of the different problems, challenges of global peace and security, was also a period of hope. And I hope in some ways that my talk in my book will be a message of hope, that even in quite difficult times, bleak times, unsettled times, there is a way out, there is an exit. And it depends not just on the big powers or big governments or big people, but ordinary people and small countries and organizations like the UN as well. Maybe I start a little bit from the history of the UN, because I think when we talk about the problems today, whether it's the big global challenges like climate change, but also the wars that we see, the terrible violence that we see in different conflicts, the sense that we are sleepwalking towards the kinds of big and potentially cataclysmic conflicts that the UN is meant to, or was founded to prevent. There's a lot of talk about the collapse of this order or that order, the liberal international order, the rules-based order. There's talk about going back to basics. There's talk about going back to the founding purposes of the UN. But what were those purposes of the UN? I mean, we have the Charter, but I think it's also important to sketch out a little bit that deeper history, to have an understanding of the context in which U Thant became Secretary General and what he tried to do. So as I think most of you know, but I think it's worth reminding, the UN was born as a wartime alliance. It was the alliance primarily of the US, the UK, and the USSR to defeat the Germans and the Japanese in World War II. And in 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and people working in the State Department believed that there needed to be, after the war, an international organization, a peace organization, a collective security organization, kind of, that would enforce the peace after the war, that would make sure that Germany and Japan were defeated, but no new aggression was going to be possible from either of those countries or from any new potential aggressors. And at the core of this was going to be an American-Soviet combination. But even by the time the ink was not even quite yet dry in San Francisco, there was a sense that that was not going to happen. There were all these plans in 1944, 45, and you can look at it in the UN archives, for the UN to actually be not just an enforcement organization, but a really muscular enforcement organization with air bases encircling the entire globe, jointly manned US and Soviet fighter bombers that would take off at a moment's notice to take on any aggressor state that might challenge them. But again, even by late 1945, people realized this is not the world that we're living in anymore. That's not going to happen. The Soviets and the Americans are not going to be able to work together anymore because of the Cold War that was unfolding and that would unfold over the next year or two. And so even by 1946, people were talking about UN reform. People were talking about UN reform. People were saying, is the UN really fit for purpose? Can it really survive the coming year or 2 years, or do we need to try something different? And so the UN evolved in different ways, and it entered into the Cold War period. And it's true that during the Cold War and the height of the Cold War in the 1950s, the Security Council was largely frozen because of the big power vetoes, not just by the Soviets, but also by the Americans and the British and the French as well. But then something unexpected happened that the founders of the UN didn't really foresee. One is decolonization, which happened very rapidly, and the emergence of new countries into the General Assembly that became a near majority by the late 1950s. But a second thing happened as well, which was the rise of the Secretary Generalship as the key organ of peace and security to mediate, to de-escalate, to prevent wars, and to end them. And to a large extent, this was the work, or the pioneering work of my grandfather's predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, who tried in a number of different conflicts from the Suez Crisis in 1956 onward to use the prestige of that office to again be that tool for the maintenance of international peace and security around sometimes the kind of deadlocks that would happen in the Security Council. But as I mentioned, something else had happened which was not foreseen by the founders of the UN, which was that most of the globe suddenly became free and independent. When we, especially sitting here in New York or sitting in the West in general, think about the history of the 20th century, we tend to think in terms of World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the post-Cold War, and whatever era we may be entering into now. But for most of the people in the world, the history of the 20th century is the history of empire and the transition from empire. And when these countries that identify themselves as the Afro-Asians at the UN in the mid-1950s onwards, for them, the real fight, and the fight they had to take to the UN, was the fight for decolonization and for making sure that independence was genuine independence. That it wasn't just a situation where the British or the French or anybody else gave a piece of paper or held a ceremony and said you're independent, but that they were coming into an international system which treated them on an equal basis and in which they had an equal right to take part and to shape as well. And so you had in New York, and you'll see this in my book, it's almost a New York immigration story as well, this wave of people from Africa, from Asia, who came in as diplomats to work at the UN, but also as missions, as ambassadors. And it was into that context that my grandfather came here as the Burmese ambassador and then became Secretary General in 1961. If we go back to 1961, and we think of the UN crisis, and we might talk about a UN in crisis now or in the recent past, but the UN was in real crisis in 1961. I mean, the Secretary General had just been killed, and we know this, a mysterious plane crash, almost certainly involving foul play. The UN was completely bankrupt. It couldn't pay its, there was indeed financial crisis. It was unable to see what its financial future was going to be, and people thought the UN might not even survive the coming weeks, let alone months at that point. And no one could imagine after the death of Dag Hammarskjöld that it would be possible for the big powers to agree on a successor. So it was at that moment, or at that point, that my grandfather, comes into the picture. And his story, as you'll see in the book, and I hope all of you will not just read but buy the book as well, which is important, the launch and the publication, is that, he had this quite remarkable backstory before he comes the UN. So he's from a well-to-do family, but then that became suddenly impoverished when he was about 15 years old. He grew up in this backwater town in Burma, about a day's steamer ride from the capital of Burma, which is then part of British India, Rangoon. And this is a little town, ramshackle wooden houses, dirt roads, no electricity, no running water. And except for 2 years that he was able to spend at university, he lived only in that little town. And he was a school teacher and then the headmaster of the school. And then at age 39, almost 39, he decides he's going to make a midlife career change. And within 10 years, he was just here living on Park Avenue and 72nd Street. He was the Burmese permanent representative to the UN, and he was the center of this very exciting global politics as a member of, or the head of one of these delegations, as part of this wave of Afro-Asians coming in to the World Organization and trying to reshape, not just this organization, but reshape the world as well. And he quickly developed a reputation in the late 1950s as the guy in the delegates' lounge, in the UN, in the different council chambers, who more or less got along with everyone. He saw himself as a pragmatist, he saw himself as a bridge builder, he saw himself as someone who wanted to build bridges, especially between the decolonized world, countries like Burma, and the West, countries like the UK and the US at the time. But when he was chosen as Secretary General, it was partly because of Burma being a neutral country, partly because of his reputation in New York at the UN, but partly because it was also a time when the non-aligned movement had just been formed, and they felt very strongly that one of their own, one of the Afro-Asians finally had to take over the UN and really embrace it and make it into their own as well. So he takes over, he has to deal with the financial crisis literally within the first 24 hours. He has to handle the crisis in the Congo, which maybe we'll have a chance to talk about later, but it's really a seminal crisis in shaping the UN at that time. He has 22,000 plus peacekeeping troops in the Congo. He wants to take a much tougher stance than his predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, against the white supremacist mercenaries and the Katanga secession in the south of the province. He's held back by the British primarily, and he decides that for him to really resolve the Congo crisis in a way that would be befitting for the UN organization and its commitment to the real sovereignty of these countries that were being decolonized, he would have to build a very strong relationship, especially with John F. Kennedy, the American president, and with Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Soviet Union. And so he does this. He meets with President Kennedy a couple of times. He flies to Crimea. He spends a day swimming and having lunch and having many discussions with Nikita Khrushchev. And by the time he leaves Crimea in August of 1961, he has a good relationship with both. He's on probation, actually, for that first year as Secretary General. He's just been appointed acting Secretary General. But what he doesn't realize and what he doesn't know is that just maybe 100 miles from where he's swimming with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet ships are sailing towards Cuba and bringing nuclear weapons, almost the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal to Cuba at that time. I'm going to say one thing about, or speak for a few minutes about Cuba and then move on, because I don't want this to be like one of those movie trailers where you feel like you've seen the whole movie. So I think it's important to leave you hanging a little bit in terms of what happens next. But Cuba is important to understand, and I think it's important also for when we think about the future of the UN as well, because it's probably, in some ways, one of the most interesting and certainly consequential cases of UN preventative diplomacy. So I think all of you know the outline, and you probably know the outline as you've seen it in the movies, as well as maybe read about it in secondary sources as well, which is the Soviets send missiles to Cuba. We now know that it was, they were already armed with nuclear warheads. The Soviets had 40,000 plus troops in Cuba, just a little bit south of Miami, far more than American intelligence estimates had thought at that time. And the tactical battlefield nuclear weapons then were in the hands of the Soviet commanders on the ground, so that if the Americans invaded Cuba without checking with Moscow, they would be able to use, and that would have almost certainly triggered off a massive nuclear confrontation that might have destroyed most of the world. So it was a serious crisis. And Kennedy, as you know, on the 22nd of October, goes on television and he announces that he's placed a quarantine around Cuba, a blockade of the island. And at that time, Soviet ships are streaming towards Cuba. Kennedy says no more offensive weapons in Cuba, and his aides are telling him he has to invade the island today, not tomorrow. So U Thant knows this. It's Sunday night, October 22nd. And for the next 24 hours, what does he do? He's in deep consultation with the other non-aligned ambassadors, Afro-Asian ambassadors, on the 38th floor. A couple of his aides see the ambassadors that he's not able to see. He's in communications with Jawaharlal Nehru in India, with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, with other Afro-Asian leaders. And he decides he's going to intervene without a mandate, without the council saying anything, without the General Assembly saying anything. He's going to intervene into the conflict. The next day, he goes to the Security Council, and he basically sets out the framework for what would become an eventual settlement of the conflict, a trade of the missiles for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. But then he begins a series of messaging to messaging to Khrushchev, messaging to Kennedy, both written public messages, but also private oral communications through the ambassadors. And basically he understood, or he guessed at that time, what I think both Kennedy and Khrushchev also sensed by then, that they were in a crisis of their own making, and it was a political crisis, not a military crisis, that Khrushchev and Kennedy, neither of them wanted to seem weak against the other, and U Thant had to craft the intervention so that he could create the space and the time necessary, maybe just hours more, days more, for diplomacy to be able to work. And so he had to craft that intervention in terms of what he said, what he didn't say, what he wrote, what he didn't write, and the messaging that he made also through third parties, including other Afro-Asian countries as well. So it's a complicated story that you'll see in my book, but eventually it turned out to have been indispensable in de-escalating the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the Russians, responding positively to an appeal from a non-aligned UN Secretary General who says, please do this on the behalf of world peace, is very different from accepting an ultimatum from an American president. He goes to Cuba, where Castro is extremely angry that deals are being done over his head. U Thant flies down to Havana on the 30th, 31st of October, and he placates Castro, who can still in different ways trigger a confrontation that could still, at that very late stage, lead to a nuclear war. And he says to Castro in one of their meetings, over many daiquiris and cigars, both cigars and daiquiris are actually big parts of the 38th floor at the time, he says, look, I'm from a small country, you're from a small country, you have every right to do what you've done, to have foreign military bases, to have missiles from foreign countries. It's your sovereign right, that's what the UN is all about. But I'm trying to paint you the bigger picture. We're on the verge of a nuclear war, a global nuclear war, and we just all have to take a deep breath and take a step back. And he begins to do this, and he begins to use U Thant as well as a neutral arbiter, a reference point for that de-escalation. And he says to U Thant, not to U Thant, but to the Cuban people on television the next morning, U Thant showed us respect. And again, that was the way in which he was able not to say yes to things coming from Moscow, who he was getting really upset with, or the Americans certainly, but to the United Nations. I think, over the following many years, U Thant faced many different challenges. I mean, we all know the Vietnam War, the Six-Day War. Again, I won't go into all of that. But I think for him, what was important was both keeping the institution alive, and if you think about it, going back to what I had said in the beginning, in October, November of 1961, no one knew if the UN was going to last even a few weeks. By the time he retired in 1971, it was an established system. And it wasn't just an established kind of organization and set of organizations, but it was something else. It was the international system based on the idea of sovereign equality that had become universal with the membership of the PRC taking China's seat, but also the process of decolonization almost being completed. And the UN on Vietnam, U Thant was not successful in stopping the war, though he tried for years, including through secret diplomacy from 1964 to 1968. But in supporting, for instance, the liberation wars in southern Africa, the UN stood firmly on the side of protecting the rights of these small states and trying to give voice to their aspirations as well. And by 1971, that had been baked into what the UN had become in a way that was fundamentally different in many ways from what the founders of the UN in 1945 foresaw. I think in the time that I have, because I'd really like to take your questions on different issues, I'm just going to go through a few photographs and then really happy to answer any questions you might have. So this is a photograph of U Thant when he was at university. He did manage to go for 2 years to university and then had to leave for financial reasons. And it's something that he talked about with Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, because Lyndon Johnson and U Thant, this is a really strange relationship, as you'll see in the book. But both men were born almost exactly the same time. They were both school teachers at exactly the same time. They both had to drop out after 2 years at university in the same year. And they were both in a small backwater town, and they were married on exactly the same day, November 13th, 1934. And so these two school teachers would face off against each other in the mid-1960s over Vietnam. But anyway, this is U Thant when he was a student. This is him as a school teacher with my mother here on the left in the late 1930s in their village. And this was just, again, not very long before he would go to Rangoon and then go onwards to the UN. When he was ambassador, he was an ally of Dag Hammarskjöld, like many of the other Afro-Asians. They saw in Dag Hammarskjöld someone who was trying to fight their corner. And on the Congo in particular, they saw many opportunities to work together. This is probably in 1960, but I'm not sure of the exact date. But this is U Thant as ambassador with the Afro-Asian leaders when they came to New York for the historic General Assembly of 1960. You have Gamal Abdel Nasser, Kwame Nkrumah, U Thant, Nehru, and Sukarno at that General Assembly meeting. And it was this group, and U Thant had been in Bandung, he had been in Belgrade for the founding of the Non-Aligned Movement, that really would then propel him into the position of Secretary General in 1961. When he becomes Secretary General, he very deliberately makes it a point of priority for him that he has as free a hand as possible in his senior appointments. And when major governments finally came around to appointing him or agreeing on his appointment, even though it had been a very fraught process, he pushed back as much as he could against not being able to choose who he wanted for his top team. I think it was France that said to him, "We of course want a French person as chef de cabinet," and he told the French ambassador, "You can veto me in the council tomorrow, but I'm not going to listen to your dictates on senior appointments." And his senior appointments did include the person who became one of his closest friends, Ralph Bunche, who was Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Special Political Affairs, and General Indrajit Ricky, who was his chief military advisor and the head of many UN peacekeeping operations in the 1960s. So it was a team of men, and this doesn't look that strange now, but in the early 1960s to see men of color at the height or the top of international diplomacy was something very new. And I would just say also maybe, and this is something that I've written about in the book, which that they were living in a still very segregated city. It was very difficult for people from Asia, and especially from Africa, to find housing in Manhattan. That's why Dr. Ralph Bunche, who was an American, but a black American, had to live in Queens at that time. But U Thant himself found it really difficult to find an apartment when he first moved here in 1957. He had trouble with his landlord. He was in a rent-controlled apartment, $400 a month for a 4-bedroom apartment, but he was being charged over $2,000 a month. And when he took that up, it's a long, complicated story in the book, his landlord said that his cat had done $6,447 in damages. And it was actually at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis that the landlord tried to pull him into court in Manhattan to testify. So this is from the New York Times at that time, and again, this is about what we remember and who we remember and how we remember history. And it's, as I've told you, what I found in the archives and the story there, but in the movies and Hollywood, but even in secondary sources, the UN and Thant are written out of history, but it's not secret history. I mean, here he is at the very top of the New York Times, and he would be over all those few weeks. It's about who subsequently was airbrushed out of the story and who remained. And again, Kennedy agrees to talks on Thant's plan. John F. Kennedy said after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Thant has put the world in his debt. But within a few weeks, the story was being spun in a very different way, that it was the story of the U.S. being tough against the Russians and the Russians backing down. This is him going to Cuba. This is these military chiefs in the Congo after they had taken on the white supremacists in Katanga, celebrating again over cigars and I'm sure many drinks at that time. This is Thant welcoming Kennedy, whom he had extremely high feelings about just a couple of weeks or a few weeks before John F. Kennedy's assassination, his last visit to the General Assembly. This is him with Nikita Khrushchev in 1964. And this is him about to go to see Lyndon Johnson at the White House in 1964, flown down by Air Force One. And, in a way that seems really difficult to imagine today. I mean, he and Lyndon Johnson saw each other quite often. When he went down, he would see him for hours, spend the whole day with his top aides. But he also refused to go down. Again, something that we wouldn't really imagine today. So once in 1966, he received a message saying the American president would like to meet him in the White House, and Thant's response back to the American ambassador was, I have nothing new to say to him, and I don't think he has anything new to say to me, because he was very upset about Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson would appear by surprise sometimes at the UN, giving Thant's aides just enough time to go downstairs to prepare to receive the President of the United States. This is him during the India-Pakistan War when he was negotiating the ceasefire with his then still quite young aide, Brian Urquhart, on the left. And a big part of Thant's work was to make sure that he had a good relationship with all the perm reps, and to spend a lot of time with the perm reps, and to introduce a lot of the perm reps, especially from the smaller countries, especially from new and young perm reps who were coming in to the UN, that they were able to meet a lot of the dignitaries who came and who he invited to his table for lunch on the 38th floor. So that's Jackie Kennedy, that's the recently former Prime Minister of France, Adlai Stevenson, who was the American ambassador, and others. So this was a daily thing that he did on the 38th floor. In those days, the Security Council often didn't meet. When it met in 1967, on the eve of the Six-Day War, it was actually the first time the Security Council had met that entire year. And he actually thought the Council should not meet until there was something specific that they had to do and could agree. Otherwise, it would generate more heat than light. And instead, he wanted these informal lunches, other venues of conversation to lower the temperature and to find ways in which solutions might be possible. This is home in Riverdale, which is, I think most of you know where Riverdale is. One of his very few relaxations was swimming. He took Sundays off, but otherwise, over 10 years, I think he only took 10 days of holiday, and which really had an effect, because he was only in his 50s at that time, but towards the end, he collapsed many times in his office from exhaustion and stress-related ailments. Sorry, that's me and my mother. This is him during the eve of the Six-Day War, going to Cairo for emergency talks with Gamal Abdel Nasser. It's Mohammed Riyad, the Egyptian foreign minister, to his right. And this is one of the meetings with Lyndon Johnson at the White House. And this is one of the surprise meetings that Johnson came up and then spent a couple of hours with him, mainly to discuss the Vietnam War on the 38th floor. This is him at one of the OAU summits with the Emperor of Ethiopia and other African leaders arriving. And this is him with me and my parents and the Apollo 11 astronauts in 1970 when they came back after their mission to the moon, again on the 38th floor. and this is when he retired. And this is his retirement party, which I talk about. It's the beginning of the book, for those of you who've read it. John Lennon was there and sang Imagine for the first time in the United States. That's him relaxing. I didn't know I was going to include that photo, but that's him relaxing in an easy chair he had brought in. And we have a video that we were going to show, a very brief one. We can go up. And he's going to talk about what kind of person would be a good Secretary General. And this is at the very end when he was about to retire. Please.
and of humor and of honor to protect him against the bitterness of frustration and the discomfort of perennial and sometimes unjustified criticism. The Secretary Generalship is not the most impossible job in the world. Let me repeat. It is not the most impossible job in the world, although it is certainly one of the most difficult. It is, without any question, one of the most rewarding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
President Anderson.
It's a YouTube.
Thank you for this brilliant sharing and looking forward to the book. My name is Pina Nepram and I'm from your neighbor, Manipur in northeast of India. I wanted to know what were the elements as an Asian, as a Buddhist, which made him such a wonderful mediator, negotiator for peace during the Cuban Missile Crisis, number one. Number two, why was this story deleted from the consciousness? Third is, what is the legacy of Thant? He's the first Asian to become the UN Secretary General. What is the legacy now, and what is non-aligned movement in today's world? Does it still exist, or is it dead? And how can we as Asians bring forth this brilliant legacy which shone like a ray of light in the 60s and 70s back to where it's needed right now in today's world? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, on the first issue, I think his Buddhism was very important to him, and it was a school of Buddhism. He was very stoical in many ways. He thought a lot about Buddhism and the ethical value system and what it should mean to his Secretary Generalship. He was also very ecumenical in different ways as well. He invited the Pope to America. It was the first visit by any pontiff to the New World, and he thought that maybe religion could play a positive role in terms of creating the international system that he wanted to see. I don't really know exactly what specific elements of his Buddhism played in the Cuban Missile Crisis, except that I found in the archives something written by an American lady who was a socialite who met him and who had also known Dag Hammarskjöld. And she said very positively of both, but she said of Hammarskjöld first, you were almost electrified in his presence, that he had this electricity. But with Thant, you met him and you felt relaxed and calm. And in his presence, you felt that things could be worked out, that he created this very calming atmosphere. And that is, I think, directly related in many ways to the kind of Buddhism that he tried to practice. In terms of why his story was erased to some extent or forgotten by many people, it's a complex one, and it took me the rest of the book to kind of try to unpack the different ways in which that might have happened. I think it had a little bit to do with Cuba, and in particular it had to do with everyone wanting to tell the story in their own way, and the UN not really being willing to or having the capacity to then crowd out those other stories. I think he felt, and his predecessors and successors in different ways as well, that it wasn't always useful for the Secretary General to take credit for different things, that it was better also to let others take credit too. That might be damaging to the institution in a way for its political capital in the long term, but I think that was a calculation that was made. I think there could have been an element of race and racism. It was a world in which people of color, especially from small countries, from countries that most people had never heard of, coming onto the international stage, they were kind of the easiest ones to kind of forget about on the side. But I think it had a lot to do with Vietnam as well. I think once you're a UN Secretary General from a small country and you take on the United States and Washington on their core national security issue, then a different set of wheels began to turn. And I think he made a lot of enemies on the American right who were supportive of the war in Vietnam, but also within the establishment as well, who until very late in the game felt that America was right in escalating the war, bombing the North, and seeking a military solution in South Vietnam. I think it had to do with the Six-Day War, when even friends of his who had been supportive or supporters who had thought like him on the Vietnam issue didn't feel the way he felt in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in terms of the need for Israel to compromise and withdraw from the occupied territory. So it was a mix of things, and one of the things I look forward to is as people read the book, that they will also tell me the answer to some of these questions, because I've tried to lay it out as best I can, but in terms of interpreting some of these things and interpreting whether he was actually right or wrong in making some of these decisions, I look forward to comments from others. I think in terms of what can be done now, I mean, I really hope, and this is not just his story, but in general, at a time when we're at a moment of, I think, inflection, but also transition, and we don't really know what's going to come next in terms of global politics, in terms of what role the UN might have or might not have. I think it's just really useful to recover a lot of these stories and histories, because it gives us more fuel for our imagination in terms of what might happen in the future.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Mr. Thant. My name is Epaphras Gibbs, and I'm a young communicator and aspiring diplomat from AUE, based in New York. My question is, how can young leaders today draw on UTEC's example to strengthen peace building and international cooperation, especially in countries facing political instability like Haiti?
Thank you very much. I think, it's difficult to get into specific conflict contexts and talk about what might be done or what might not be done. But I think what's important to take away from this story and from the history that I've tried to tell is that at a moment of global crisis, when the UN looked like it might not survive, and when competing world orders were clashing in the council chambers across the street, the difference that was made to stabilize the UN, to improve the international system, came from the most unexpected quarter. I mean, who would have thought that a school teacher from Burma would be part of the answer But who would have thought even that these new Afro-Asian states would be part of the answer? So I think the answer is that we have not in the past relied on the great powers to come up with the answers. The history of the 20th century is largely the history of many others who've come together through networks, coalitions, formal, informal, including and especially at the UN, that has shaped the international system. So I think at this time we can hope for the best in terms of what great power politics might be, but I think maybe this is a little bit different to your question, but I think it's worth saying is that I think one has the feeling all the time, especially as a historian and looking back, but also looking at the present day, that we've unlearned so much. That in the 1950s and 60s, the men and women at the UN then, but also in the global publics, were still so close to the devastation of the early 20th century. And, you know, we hear now talk about great power politics and spheres of influence and balance of power, and this great power wants to do that and that great power wants to do something else, and they might clash in this way, or we need to rearm in different ways. But in the 50s and 60s, even people, I think, who would normally have a kind of hawkish take on foreign policy knew that there had to be a different way, because it was exactly that kind of language and that kind of thinking that led to World War I and World War II. And so I think reinventing the way in which we think about politics is important, but I think it's also important to remember the kinds of lessons that meant that in the 50s and 60s, people were desperately trying to make sure that whatever the problems, whatever the challenges, whatever the conflicts, that another world war didn't happen, and the UN would be part of the answer to that as well.
Is this right? Thank you. My name is David Greco. I'm just a friend visiting the United Nations campus here. Mr. Thant, was that you in the family photo in the center as a young child?
Yes.
Oh, I can tell you that as a 9, 10-year-old boy in 1962, whenever General Secretary of Thant's name was mentioned, and this is as a young boy, it was silence and reverence. So his history was not deleted then, it's not deleted now. But the question I have for you, I mean, his name was provoked reverence whenever it was in the newspaper or on the news, TV or newsprint. And this is a young boy. But the question I have, subsequent to the Cuban Missile Crisis, can you tell us anything about the test ban treaty that was between Khrushchev, Nikita, Kennedy, and John the 23rd, the Pope in Rome?
Yeah. Sure. Thank you very much for that question. I think you're right that, I mean, he's not completely airbrushed out of history in the sense that no one knows him. But I think when I talk to people who are under 50 years old or even 60 years old, I think very few ordinary people know him, whereas in the 60s he was very well known, as you suggest. The Gallup poll in 1967 placed him at sixth in terms of the most admired men in the world, above Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. A poll of young British people, kids and young people in the late 60s, placed him just below Elvis Presley in popularity. But I think, it's partly maybe due to things that he said and did, but it was also partly because of the political investment that so many governments had made in the UN and in the office of the Secretary General in the years leading up to him becoming Secretary General. So he inherited also an office that was very, very prestigious at the time. When he would go somewhere, he would have a 21-gun salute, maybe not like President Trump now in the UK, but he would have a big sort of welcome. And world leaders would spend hours or even days with him, right? So I think partly it's the political investment in that office which made it really important, which meant that when he did say something, when he did make a statement, when he did intervene in something like Cuba, there was already this built-in sense that this was a really important thing and everyone should pay attention and focus on that as well. I think with the nuclear test ban treaty, he was there with Kennedy and not with Kennedy and Khrushchev, but with Khrushchev and the American delegation and also the UK delegation. Those were the three nuclear powers at the time. And in some ways, it was an American, Soviet, British accord that had been negotiated by their governments. But I think what he said, and I know this is what he would have thought at the time, that the atmospherics around this or the context in which this became possible was also due to the constant pressure over many years that the non-aligned movement and before that the Afro-Asians had made in the General Assembly, putting disarmament front and center of what the UN was all about and needed to focus on. And it was the resolutions and the speeches that were made by all of these leaders from the Afro-Asian countries, the broader non-aligned movement, that created the context in which also Washington, Moscow, and London moved towards this initial partial test ban treaty in 1964 as well.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. It's been really enlightening. I was just up down at an event that Jeff Sachs had organized looking at reform of the United Nations, the Security Council, financing for sustainable development. And I was just wondering if you had any insights from your amazing research on your father's work and life about the kind of reforms that we're in right now, especially for those of us who are in the UN system. Would love to hear from you on that.
I mean, I think one of his weaknesses in some ways was I don't think he was a very good manager. I don't think he thought very much about the mechanics of the UN organization, which was then beginning to be quite a sprawling bureaucracy at that time. There was a lot of talk about UN reform, especially by the late 1960s and 1970s, the need to kind of rationalize the UN system in some way and think about financing the UN in different ways as well. But it wasn't really something that he focused on very much. And I think maybe drawing from that, one thing that I would say is that when we think about the future, we shouldn't start with the UN. We should start with what actually needs to happen and what the dangers actually are. And I think we have many different global challenges that we all know about. The UN should be part of the answer to that. But maybe others can play a big role as well. But I think the UN's core responsibility, the reason it was founded, and I think something that the non-aligned, the Afro-Asians also felt very strongly, was to prevent another cataclysmic world war. And maybe I'm wrong, but I have this feeling that we are sleepwalking back into the kinds of dynamics where a great power war is not impossible. And if we think about the big conflicts in the world today, whether it's in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in the potential conflicts in the Western Pacific, I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we, at a moment of potential escalation, diffuse those crises? Who would play the role the UN Secretary General played during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Are there regional organizations, NGOs, individual governments that could step up to the plate at that point? But what kind of UN, what kind of office of the UN Secretary General do we need at those moments as well? So I think we have to kind of walk backwards from the actual challenges that are in front of us today and could be in front of us in the next 5-10 years, and then think about the kind of UN that we need rather than starting with the UN in answering the question.
That's all the time we have for questions, but I would just like to thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ray.
Thank you. And I would also like to now introduce a champion of multilateralism, another one, an innovator in international public policy, and dedicated to building the impactful public-private partnerships and supporting the UN system. This is Elizabeth Cousins, President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation. Thank you.
I think it's safe to say that we are in a room of champions of multilateralism. It feels really good, right? So thank you, Thant, first of all. I mean, this is such a privilege. I've had the benefit of being in some sessions to hear you walk through the tremendous insights from your book. I've read it several times. I commend it to all of you, but thank you for writing it. I'll say a few other words of thank you. Thank you to UNICEF for hosting us. Thank you to the UN Bookstore for facilitating everything. And truly thank you all for being here. I just want to offer a few very brief thoughts in closing. I feel immensely grateful for this book, and I think we all should be, partly because it's a fabulous time capsule of the 60s, and among the things I learned, my grandmother and your grandfather share television viewing preferences. They both loved Columbo, and there are all kinds of interesting little reminders of that period in this book. but because this is a history that is invaluable for us right now. I think I'm always reminded every time I have read your book and thought about it, I keep thinking about that phrase on rearview mirrors, objects in this mirror are closer than they appear. And I think the history that you've told is very present with us, and importantly so. I think we all see the profound risks of this moment, certainly for the United Nations, but for international cooperation writ large. The pressures are multiple, they're very clear, and I think it isn't overstating the situation to describe this as a time not only of transition, but of existential challenge, both for the UN and for everything it stands for, including the ideals it may not always live up to. It is sometimes easy to become fixated on the immediate drama of the foreground and turbulence that we're facing, especially with UNGA right before us next week. And most of us, I will say, I confess to this myself, if we zoom out at all, we tend to zoom out to more recent history. We zoom out to our own perspectives. We talk a lot about the post-Cold War period that shaped a lot of our careers and perspectives. And there are lessons from that, but there are also, I think, misdirections if looking only that far. This book obviously zooms out farther, and as we've just heard, it zooms out to a period that is arguably more relevant to today than the more recent history, in a time that was every bit as fractured, as unpredictable and confounding as our own, but when, as you've told so brilliantly, unexpected progress was possible. So I think today, as we're all in our various ways trying to find a path to renew and revitalize this indispensable institution around some kind of vision that can coalesce and command broad gauge support, that vantage is not only poignant, it's also essential. So 3 quick things. It reminds us that the UN's history unfolded mostly in times that were terrible, in times of geopolitical tension and turbulence, and it still achieved many things. It illustrates very powerfully the power of individuals, of character, of imagination, not just of the Secretary General, but the people around him or her. And it insists, I think, very clearly something that you all know in this room, that when the UN has achieved many things in this world, it's always done it against impossible odds. Every single time. So particularly in a room that I know is full of many UN public servants, I also really want to thank you. Your work is often unheralded, often unrewarded. I know you are under extraordinary pressures these days, and we all owe you an enormous debt for everything that you do and everything you've committed your own careers to. So thank you again. If you have bought Peacemaker already, you can pick up your copy in the lobby. If you haven't bought it, buy it. That's important. And I wish everybody a wonderful rest of your afternoon, a safe and productive UNGA, and look forward to working with you in other halls of committed multilateralists over the weeks ahead. So thank you all.